Okay, today I'd like to talk about meiosis and mitosis and life cycles. So you've seen these terms before, but they can be confusing. In particular, it's confusing how meiosis and mitosis sound very similar. And then we have these terms haploid and diploid. So let's jump right in. So what does haploid mean? Take a moment, pause if you'd like, and think this through. Does it mean half the chromosomes, twice the chromosomes, one copy of each chromosome, or none of the above? Okay, so the answer we're looking for here is one copy of the chromosome, but in particular I want to highlight this half of the chromosomes. It's kind of natural to think about haploid as meaning half because it sort of sounds similar, but also because we're accustomed to thinking about ourselves. And in ourselves, we are diploid. We'll get to what exactly this means. We are diploid, and so our gametes are haploid, and they have half of the chromosomes of a different cell. Of a diploid cell. But that's not actually what it means, so we want to try to erase this difference. So instead, kind of the haploid state is the natural one to think about because it has one copy of each chromosome. And actually the diploid state, though we're very familiar with it because we are mostly diploid, that's kind of the weird state. So with that kind of primer, let's jump in a little further. So let's also get to these questions of mitosis versus meiosis. So remember, mitosis is kind of the simple one, and meiosis is kind of the weird one. So mitosis is just cell copying. And it's going to make exact copies of the DNA so that both descendant cells of a mitosis should have identical DNA. And meiosis is the weirder thing where there's a reduction in the amount of DNA, and it leads to the products of meiosis having half as much DNA as the start. So the key here is in mitosis we want to think about copying, and in meiosis we want to think about reduction. Okay, so this video is going to focus mostly on mitosis, although a little bit of meiosis as well. So here we can see it depicted, so let's take a minute and get accustomed to the visual language that we'll be using throughout these videos. So here you notice in this diploid cell we have 4 chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4. What I mean by this, notice we have 2 short ones and 2 long ones. So that I mean these 2 are 2 homologous chromosomes, these are 2 homologous chromosomes. So if this were a human, okay, if it were a human it would have 46 chromosomes instead of 4. But if it were a human that would mean basically that we inherited a short chromosome and a long chromosome from our mom, and a short chromosome and a long chromosome from our dad. Okay then, so in mitosis, you can see we're just copying it. These diploid cells look identical to the initial diploid cell. So this is just, mitosis is just the way that cells replicate, that they copy themselves. And this means most of the bodies in human, right? So most of the bodies in humans are diploid cells that are replicating by mitosis. So then meiosis is this reduction. So see here, we start out with 4 chromosomes. So we're saying this cell undergoes meiosis. And instead of having 2 copies of each chromosome, 2 short ones and 2 long ones, this is going to give rise to products that have 1 short chromosome and 1 long chromosome. So notice these haploid cells have 1 copy of each different kind of chromosome. And so this is, again, the definition of haploid. 1 copy of each kind of chromosome. And in humans, we're accustomed to thinking about this as eggs and sperm cells. Okay, now, before we go on, this is entirely correct that most cells in the body in humans are diploid, and egg and sperm cells are haploid. In fact, only egg and sperm cells are haploid in humans. So that's what you've learned about this is absolutely correct. Eggs and sperms are haploids, other cells are diploids. However, as we go forward, we're going to learn about other organisms in which the diploid and haploid states or cells are different. They aren't eggs and cells versus body cells. And so we're going to learn that more generally that this cycle between haploids and diploids is a very general thing of eukaryotes, and we'll see it in very different patterns. Okay, so here's a good question to stimulate your thinking. Are haploid cells only produced by meiosis? I'll give you a moment. Go ahead and pause it if you like. Okay, so in fact, kind of any one of these answers would be correct, surprisingly. The strictest answer is that neither is true, as we'll learn. But a lot of you will have answered true because in humans, it's the case that haploid cells are only produced by meiosis. So let's dig down a little bit further into this. So in humans, it looks like this. We have our diploid cells, and then some subset of them divide by meiosis to give rise to eggs and sperm. And once an egg and sperm is produced by this reductive process of meiosis, they will not undergo further mitosis. So what's the next stage for an egg cell or a sperm cell? Well, most egg and sperm cells just die, but those that continue on, an egg cell fuses with a sperm cell, right? So the next thing that happens for a sperm cell, if anything, in humans is that it undergoes fusion with an egg, not that it undergoes more mitosis. So for those of you who answered that this was true, this is probably what you're thinking about, that in humans, it is the case that the products of meiosis, eggs and sperm cells, do not undergo further mitotic divisions. But in yeast, they do. Okay, so in yeast has haploid cells and diploid cells, but the relationship is very different. So to remind you, yeast is a single-celled organism. So it's not the case that they have a multi-celled body made up of diploid cells and gametes made up of haploids. Instead, they have single-celled stages that are both diploid or haploid. And in fact, in most yeast, what happens is that the haploid cell is dominant. Or I shouldn't use dominant. The haploid cell is the most common form, and it reproduces by mitosis, right? So this one cell would reproduce, giving rise to two cells by mitosis. So for some of you, this will be unfamiliar. We're accustomed to thinking of mitosis as something that's associated with diploidy because we're accustomed to thinking about ourselves. But I think this is confusing because it suggests that there's something special about mitosis, that it can only happen in diploid cells. And in fact, mitosis can happen in haploid cells, in diploid cells, in cells that have weird ploidies, that have 3 or 4 copies of the genome, or that have unbalanced ploidies. So mitosis is just a very general process by which cells copy themselves. And we want to try to break this association between diploidy and mitosis. So here's an even less familiar case. Okay, so we are here looking at the life cycle of a plant. And so here we have the diploid plant. This is a fern that we're looking at. And these diploid plants, some cells undergo meiosis to give rise to haploid cells. So we're accustomed to thinking of these as sort of like our gametes. So if this were ourselves, these haploid cells from 2 different plants would fuse to give rise to a diploid. But in these plants, something entirely different happens. A single one of these haploid cells, without undergoing fusion with another haploid cell, will itself give rise to a multicellular stage. So over here we have a multicellular plant. You'll see it looks different, but it's the same species. A single one of these cells without fusion will undergo mitosis to give rise to a sizable multicellular plant. So this is weird, right? We're not accustomed to this. This would be like the equivalent of a single sperm dividing and becoming a multicellular person. So a totally different stage from ourselves. Okay, so now we have the diploid plant undergoes meiosis to give rise to haploid cells. They undergo mitosis to give rise to a multicellular plant. Now this haploid plant, some of its cells now are going to become gametes. Okay, so some cells from this haploid plant now become gametes, and here's another gamete from a different plant, another multicellular haploid plant from the same species. And now these two are going to fuse. And now this gives rise to a diploid cell, and now this diploid cell is going to give rise by mitosis to a diploid plant. Okay, so we've got a stage that's like ourselves, a diploid multicellular organism, but the rest of the cycle is quite unfamiliar, right? It's like our sperm and egg cells. Each one would go give rise to a multicellular organism, and only then one of their cells would fuse with another one from a different plant. And so one important point to point out here is that we have mitosis happening both among haploid cells and among diploid cells. So this makes clear that mitosis is not something that only happens in diploid cells. It can happen in kind of any kind of cell. And so this kind of brings us back. Again, we want to focus that mitosis is cell division, right? So it's cell duplication, cell division. It does not specifically have to do with diploidy. This is the simple thing. And meiosis, we'll be getting to, is something weirder. Okay, so here's a question. Haploid cells are only ever produced by meiosis. Go ahead and pause it if you want a moment. Okay, so as we learned, we can have haploid cells that undergo mitosis to give rise to other haploid cells. And so in this case, this would be false, because haploid cells can be produced by meiosis of diploid cells or by mitosis of haploid cells. So just to point out this, I realize that this is confusing. So why is it so confusing? Part of it is we're so accustomed to thinking about ourselves, but in fact haploid and diploid stages play different roles in different organisms. So, and the reason that I'm trying to break this association is because for me, I think it really helps to understand what these processes are, to understand the basic fundamental role of these processes, the function of these processes, without this weird association of ourselves as diploid organisms with specific gametes. And so, to point this out, here we're looking at a tree of all eukaryotes. This is all of animals, right? This is both all the things you'd immediately think of as animals, insects, ourselves, worms, but also corals, sponges, all kinds of things. That's just this one branch. Whereas this whole of eukaryotes, all these different groups, undergo meiosis and mitosis. So this particular association we have of diploid cells undergoing mitosis and then haploid cells being just sperm and eggs, that's just in this one little branch. And even among this huge diversity of eukaryotes, multicellularity is fairly rare, having evolved only a handful of times. Right? So here are fungi. Well, fungi include mushrooms and other multicellular species, but they also include the unicellular yeasts that we talked about earlier. So it's not even the case that these are all multicellular. So you can say we have all these different groups, of which only a handful have any multicellular representatives. So this idea that diploidy and haploidy have to do with multicellularity is actually not true. It's a much more general phenomenon seen across all these different species. Okay, so let's focus in on what the life cycle looks for many unicellular eukaryotes. So as opposed to ourselves, where this diploid stage is the multicellular, in this case we're talking about where it's always unicellular. So this is kind of opposite what we're accustomed to. We're accustomed to thinking of ourselves as diploid organisms that are almost always diploid and just have this tiny little egg and cell stage. But here it's quite the opposite. So for many unicellular eukaryotes, they spend most of their time over here, where one cell will give rise to, will undergo mitosis to give rise to 2, to 4, to 8, and so forth. And so this is where they spend most of their time. And in fact, this process, which is fusion and meiosis, this is the rare thing, right? So, and in fact, Many lineages will undergo mitosis for many, many cell divisions, and will only undergo meiosis, for instance, when they're put under stress. So here is our cycle. If we're going to spend most of our time, if these organisms spend most of their time haploid, then we need some way to get them back to being haploid. And so this is similar to what we're accustomed to, but it happens very quickly. So in humans, this fusion between two haploid cells, between an egg and a cell, gives rise to a very long-lived, very large diploid. And then we think about meiosis as being the thing that happens. You know, this happens to make eggs and cells, and then we're immediately back to the diploid. Sorry, I should have said eggs and sperm. So in this case, it's the same thing. Fusion occurs, and then meiosis occurs, but it's very rapid. Fusion occurs, and this diploid can often be almost transient. So these cells don't spend too much time in the diploid stage. They just fuse and then immediately undergo meiosis to give rise to reduction. To give rise to haploids. So while I've somewhat simplified things here, there's a huge amount of diversity among unicellular eukaryotes. My point by doing this is to show a very different life cycle, which shares a haploid and a diploid stage, shares fusion of haploids to give rise to diploids, and shares meiotic division of diploids to give rise to haploids, but which is different from us in various different ways. So we're starting to see the general patterns, the things that are shared across lineages, across species, which I hope make clear really what fusion, meiosis, and mitosis are. So here's another example. This is the malaria parasite. Here depicted is Plasmodium falciparum, which is the most deadly human malaria parasite, but there are in fact many different malaria parasites. And so what happens here is, let's start with an infection. An infection of a human, this is my picture of a human, can be caused by one or a few or a handful of haploid cells. Those haploid cells infect the human, and by mitosis of these haploid cells, they can give rise to, say, 1 trillion cells within the human body. So this is a parasite infecting us, giving rise to 1 trillion cells. This is all haploid. So then the mosquito then takes a blood meal from an infected human, and along with it takes many malaria parasites, all of which are also haploid. Okay, so all of this is haploid. This whole stage is haploid. Now, these cells in pairs, so 2 cells will fuse in the mosquito and immediately undergo meiosis to give rise to the next round of haploid cells. So here, similarly to yeast, what we have is a very long haploid stage in which the haploid cells undergo mitosis, and a very brief meiotic stage that's associated with this particular stage in the life cycle, which is transmission through the mosquito. So here's baker's yeast, S. cerevisiae. This is both what's used in baking and in production of alcohol, and also a very common lab model. It's used to study many different processes in the lab. And so this is a way of depicting the cerevisiae life cycle. And so what we're seeing here is that 99.9% of divisions are asexual. They're mitotic, just copying divisions. And this sexual stage is very brief. And so we have fusion to give rise to a diploid, and then meiosis to get right back to the haploid, and then we go around here 999 more times. So here's yet one more. So in this case, I guess it makes, so here is the diploid stage. So in this case, we have the diploid, and certain of these cells undergo meiosis to give rise to a haploid cell. Those haploid cells can then either give rise to a female multicellular plant or a male multicellular stage. And then the male and female gametes fuse within the female, and giving rise to another diploid stage. And so this is the life cycle of Chondrus cryptus, which I believe is a red alga, which has these multicellular stages, both at the haploid stage and at the diploid stage. So one thing that's interesting to sort of speculate about, though we don't really know why, is that we find that in general, multicellular species are more likely to have long diploid stages, like ourselves, right? We have a very long diploid stage with only this transient egg and cell haploid stage. So we don't know why this is the case, but people speculate maybe this is due to protection against cancer-like processes. We haven't discussed cancer yet, but we'll be discussing it, and it can involve mutation of genes. And so the idea is if you have 2 copies of a gene, then maybe that makes you less vulnerable to losing both genes, both copies of the gene. But this is still really speculation. We really don't know. Okay, so let's try to reinforce some of the stuff we're thinking about here. Chlamydomonas reinhardtii is a single-celled green alga. Is it probably mostly haploid, diploid, and even combination, or neither? It's hard to guess. I'll give you go ahead and pause if you want to think about it for a second. So we learned that a lot of single-celled organisms spend most of their time haploid. And so a good guess here would be haploid without knowing much about it. Okay, let's stay with our same alga. So it's a single-celled alga. Does it probably mostly undergo meiosis, mitosis, an even combination, or it's hard to guess? Go ahead and pause if you'd like a minute. Okay, so we learned that most organisms, both multicellular and unicellular, mostly undergo mitosis. Remember, we looked at we said that most unicellular organisms mostly undergo mitosis, but it's also the case that most cell divisions in our body are mitotic, not meiotic. Okay, so let's do another example. Ectocarpus is a multicellular brown alga. Is this mostly probably haploid, diploid, and even combination, or it's hard to guess? Go ahead and pause if you like. So we learned, though there are many exceptions, that many multicellular organisms are diploid. And we said that might have something to do with avoiding cancer-like situations. Okay, what about, do we expect in this organism that most cell divisions occur by mitosis or meiosis? Well, we learned that in pretty much all organisms that mitosis is the main form of cell division, so we'd expect mitosis is more frequent than meiosis. Okay, so take-homes from this section. Most eukaryotes are usually haploid, that is, most unicellular eukaryotes are usually haploid, and most eukaryotes are unicellular. Then they undergo a round of fusion to form diploids, and that this is often followed immediately by meiosis. And we learned that meiosis is often associated with specific life stages, as we learned in the mosquito stage in malaria, or with the onset of some sort of stress.